Kia ora, everyone. My name is Andrea, and some of you might know me from previous webinars. And I'm really pleased to see that the interest is still high, although we have moved to level 1. So fabulous and fantastic that you're all here. Thank you very much for coming. And as you know, we started these webinar series during the lockdown period. And it's actually, it's going to continue until September. And we have a few special guests lined up as well. So watch this space. But all the webinars will be screened on a Wednesday or Thursday usually, as you know, and they are part of or will become part of a booklet that is called Progressive Thinking and Possible Futures for Public and Community Services. And some of you know that we have already done 3 books on progressive thinking, or in our progressive thinking series, and one was on tax, one on housing, and one on the future of work. And yeah, and you can access those books on our website, but also this book will be published, because we can print again now, at the end of the year. So once we have all the chapters together. Just a quick run through how we are going to do the webinar. Most of you will know as well. We'll have a quick introduction at the beginning. And then Peter will go through his chapter and summarize some of his main ideas for local government. And then we'll have a bit of a discussion. And you are all invited to post your questions. And please use the question and answer function, not the chat function for your questions. So other people can vote for your questions as well, and I can ask them. Yeah, I think that's probably it. Or one thing I should mention, actually, from past experiences, sometimes you post very long questions, and that makes it quite difficult for Peter and myself. So please keep your questions short. If you feel like you need to draft a longer kind of question and a bit of an introduction to your question, then we might be able to get it to Peter afterwards, and he can answer it after the webinar. But let's get to Peter now. So very warm welcome to Peter McKinlay, the Director of Local Government Thinktank. And Peter, by the way, is very active on LinkedIn, and he has done quite a few articles recently that he published there on everything local government. So feel free to connect with Peter on LinkedIn as well, and you can also, you know, ask those more in-depth questions, longer questions via LinkedIn. But yeah, as always, Peter has told me, you know, 3 words that describe him and his work. And his 3 words were visionary, connector, and enabler. So welcome, Peter, and please introduce yourself and explain to us what those 3 words mean that you chose.
I shall do just that. I've been active, I suppose, for something like 25 years, looking at what's happening with local government and local governance internationally. I've taken the unusual view for a New Zealand resident of thinking that what happens overseas might be relevant here. And one of the things that I've observed over those years is that in areas like local governance and working with community and so on, we tend to develop our own ways of doing things. And that's partly a function of distance. It's an awful long way to anywhere else. And partly a function of lack of interaction, I think. And also the way that over many, many years, New Zealand has developed as a very highly centralised society, with much decision-making flowing from Wellington rather than seen as flowing up from places outside Wellington. So, not wanting to be too pejorative, if you compare democracies around the globe, we're at the top-down end of the scale. And it's, I guess, people have felt reasonably comfortable with that for a very long time. But coming back to the three words, visionary in the sense of looking at the potential of local governance and what could be as compared with what is, and the gap is actually quite wide. Connector in the sense of seeking to link New Zealanders, particularly those with an interest in local governance or public policy generally, with practice internationally, so as to see what others have done, look over the fence and see how their grass grows. And the third one, enabler, working with people to help them understand how to bring that knowledge to bear within their own communities and their own organisations. So that really is, that's the three words. Should I move on to the chapter itself now?
Well, if you want to, yeah, thank you so much. So you wrote on local government and well-being, right? So really interesting topic for many of our members and surely for our audience. So maybe you want to give us a bit of a run through.
Yeah.
What's yours?
The starting point is really around the impact of COVID-19 and what that implies for governance and government at its different levels here. It starts with recognizing that internationally there's almost a consensus that effective recovery from COVID-19 is going to depend very much on enabling engaged communities. And the background to that is an awareness that one of the outcomes from COVID-19 is likely to be a significant increase in inequality. Think where unemployment, for example, is going to impact. It's not at the top end of the scale in terms of incomes by and large, it's at the bottom end. The worry that a number of the think tanks and others I connect with internationally is there's a very real risk to social stability. And indeed, one of the leading think tanks based in London has raised the question that this could be a threat to democracy itself. Looking at the pre-COVID situation with the rise of populism, of the growing popularity of autocratic leaders and what used to be democratic policies, and a sense that unless we can turn that around, and in the words of a former head of the Home Civil Service in the UK, restore voice, choice and control to communities who've been excluded from the political process, then we're going to have some very serious problems on our hands indeed. Now, that's not part of the conventional understanding in New Zealand. We haven't really got our heads around that. And we haven't, I think, yet got to this point of understanding that in terms of enabling empowered communities, that's really the core business of local government. And it's not, whether you like them or hate them, they are the part of the public sector that people locally feel they have a sense of ownership and connection with. They'll kick them and they'll swear at them, but try and take them away and they won't quite be out on the streets, but they'll certainly give you the thumbs down, as we can see over the past few years of attempts to merge councils and so on and so forth. People say, it mightn't be the greatest, but it's mine and I'm hanging on to it. So there's a really strong and really unutilized resource in terms of the potential for local government to be effective leaders within their communities, enabling genuine community governance. That's very much not, I think, currently central government's attitude. In fact, if you look at the public sector reforms, there's a very real sense coming through those that regionally the role of the public sector, the national public sector, is going to be one of building communities locally more effectively in order to deliver the services that central government is responsible for. And that's a worrying development, not as an anti-central government statement, but in terms of effectiveness and what's actually required on the ground. And part of the background to that, of course, is that in New Zealand historically, local government has not had any significant involvement in the delivery of major social services. So it hasn't really been seen as having a role in working with communities as compared with acting as what most people think of local government as being, as local infrastructure companies. So there's been I think, a serious lack of understanding of potential, notwithstanding the fact that when you look at the Local Government Act, it's probably got the most pro-local governance, pro-community democracy mandate of any local government sector in the developed world, which is an interesting little anomaly. One of the interesting things for me in terms of looking at the potential is to see what's been happening with public health in the UK. In 2012, responsibility for public health was transferred from the NHS, essentially political commissioning groups within the NHS structure, to principal local authorities. And the results have been very positive because it's placed with local government a responsibility which they're better able to deliver, because most of the determinants of health status, when you look at them closely, turn out to be place-based. Transport, housing, access to recreational services, which has been a biggie in the UK and has really benefited from the shift. And it's an illustration of the potential that exists when part of a responsibility in a major wellbeing service is actually devolved to the local level where it turns out it's best discharged. One of the challenges that one always runs into in this area when you talk about empowered communities, working with communities, is where do you find the community? And that can be difficult. You can do what electoral commissions do. You can get a map and set some criteria, the plus or minus 10%, one that we use in our electoral system, for example, and draw a line on a map. The evidence is that doesn't actually tell you what the community is. That gives you a group of people who have a particular electoral right in a particular area, but no necessary sense of identity. What's emerged from practice internationally is that if you want to find communities, you need to create a means for the communities to tell you where they are. Portland, Oregon did this some years ago and has been an exemplar. It had a need to work with its communities because it was running into strife on some major stuff, and adopted a policy under which it said, okay, we don't know where our communities are, in the sense of, we can say, this is community X and this is community Y. And so we will recognise as community organisations any organisation that meets these criteria. And they were about, it can tell us what its boundary is, it can demonstrate it has the support of the people within that boundary, it's got a democratic structure, a few other bits and pieces. And that was very powerful. But the fascinating thing is that in a city of now about 600,000, in a metropolitan area of 2 million, going down that path produced 94 separate communities. In other words, an average size of around 6,000. When you think about that, that's people coalescing around the local shopping centre, school, church, whatever. And that's really where people relate to. This is my place, my neighbourhood. This is what really interests me. And from a public policy perspective, that's where you need to be thinking about, okay, if we're strengthening community, if we're building social cohesion, if we're looking at how communities can get involved in problem solving and take some burden off the state, that's the level at which work needs to take place. Now, tell that to Peter Hughes, and he would say, I can't work with what in New Zealand would turn out to be something like 900 separate communities across the country. I've got to have something very simple. Give me 12 or 13 regions and I'm happy. So we need to find ways in which we can integrate the needs of a central government with major cross-country service delivery with communities and their own individual and specific needs. If you look globally again at what happens at a community, one of the really fascinating things is when you move to a point where there's a focus in a policy sense on recognizing the potential of communities and exploring how that can be unleashed, you get an incredible range of different initiatives. I've talked about an important example previously, but if you look around the globe now, some of the things that are getting people really excited, something called participatory budgeting, began in Brazil about 30 years ago. And sitting behind that is the sense that here's an entity which has a set of service responsibilities in relation to a particular area. That entity might, within that area or part of that area, say, okay, we've got X $100,000 or $1 million available for this set of service activities within this area. You tell us what our priorities should be. And if you are clever enough and you understand how to enable the kind of conversation that involves, it takes place over time, it needs to bring the community together, it needs to be supported in terms of, if you're comparing option X against option Y, what's involved technically, so it needs technical support, but it's seen as a really critical way of building community and better targeting public sector activity. One of the really big things about building community and tapping into community knowledge is you end up saving money, because a community typically can tell you more about the place than as even a local government staff are, let alone central government, than you're likely to know from what you've been doing. So partnering at a community level is not just hand on heart, local democracy is lovely. It's also very, very good in terms of effective resource management. One of the UK's leading think tanks has a work program going in which it's arguing that we've got past the stage at which we can say, okay, if a problem comes up, the state can solve it and throw a few bureaucrats and some money at it. The taxpayer, the ratepayer, can no longer afford that, especially given the increasing complexity of what we're dealing with. And their argument is we need to find ways of enabling communities to take that responsibility for a lot of what happens within their area and of developing solutions that can deal with that. And there's some very good examples of how that can work. Wiltshire Council in the UK has been very, very good at working with its communities through a process in their public health activity, which has enabled the identification of an enormous number of community-based solutions that previously the council would have had to pay for. So great stuff going on. Civic crowdfunding is another, where we're used to crowdfunding here. This is designed to not just raise funds for a community, but to build community capability. There's a very strong emphasis on what's called an anchor institution process. The argument that institutions which belong to the community, the council, the local hospital if there is one, the local educational institution, things of that kind, perhaps locally based major private firms, should come together and as part of their objective be very focused on what we're trying to do as a community. How do we build strength? How do we address issues like inequity? And some very, very successful examples. Preston City Council in the UK is well worth a look at. And one of the things we have to get past here, though, and getting there, is the culture within both central government and local government. I draw a distinction between two types of council. What I call the administrative council, and COVID-19 has really highlighted this, the council whose focus is primarily on how do we maintain the ability of the organisation to deliver the things the organisation believes it should deliver. And when you take that approach, the well-being of community, it's still there, but it's not your primary focus. The alternative council, the style of council, is what I call the well-being council, whose approach is everything we do should be done with an eye on how it optimises the well-being of our communities. They're very different styles of approach. The first one, to New Zealand ears, sounds like a more efficient way of operating and a better way of managing resources. The reality, and you only see the reality when you compare with international experience, is the Administrative Council is seriously inhibited in its ability to do what it needs to do because of that approach. The council that actually makes better use of resources and gets better outcomes is the Wellbeing Council that says our primary focus is the wellbeing of our community. Reason? Among other things, that draws on community knowledge, community skill, and it builds trust. In 2017, Local Government New Zealand did a survey of public attitudes towards local government. 17% of respondents thought that local government was doing an okay job. 83% didn't. And among the reasons, councils don't exercise leadership, councils don't listen to people. That's the Administrative Council getting on doing the administrative job. The Wellbeing Council wasn't in that survey because few, if any, New Zealand councils are yet in that position. That's probably enough for me on that. And I'm sure well, I hope there are people who will have questions. There may be even people who might disagree with what I've said.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter.
We can deal with them, can't we?
Oh, of course, of course. We already have a few questions, actually, and some really interesting ones. As always, I think maybe the first one that I would like to ask you, because I think it clarifies the structure and maybe some of the systemic issues that are inherent to the problems that local government face, is a question around regional and local government as well, because our participants had the impression that you connected central government directly.
I'm finding you're breaking up, unfortunately.
Sorry, that you connected central government directly to local communities, but you neglected the role of regional and also local government a little bit. You elaborated a little bit on the Wellbeing Council, so maybe you can flesh that out a little bit more and tell us how that Wellbeing Council would relate to the communities, but also relate to central government.
Okay, starting first, my reading of the public sector reforms, and in particular what the Minister has been saying about the regional level, and indeed what is now happening on the ground, is that there's a process in place which, when you follow it through and look at the logic of the process, eventually ends up with central government taking the lead role in trying to work with and enable communities. And that is, and in a way, it's gap filling, because central government clearly wants to make a better job of delivering services locally. But it's also not an effective role for local government. And there's a bunch of stuff that will tell you that's the case. The Productivity Commission report on more effective social services is a good New Zealand example, but there's a lot of stuff from elsewhere. How does the Wellbeing Council connect with its communities? Well, first, going back to the Portland example, but others, it needs to recognise that it has communities. And the Wellbeing Council will realise and will understand the difference between a formal line on a map and people recognising that this is my community. So part of the process will be finding ways of enabling communities to emerge. And that's where things like participatory budgeting and a range of other tools can be very, very effective. Part of it is it's what happens in here, in the headspace, how you think about your role. If you think about your role as we primarily run a local infrastructure company, then you'll be taking a very different approach. If you think that your role is we were elected to decide, then you'll distance yourself from your community, because basically you're saying your voice doesn't matter. If you look at a lot of the experience internationally, you'll see that the way in which you deliver services can shut out a community or bring in a community. One of the strong, I think, pieces of advice is respect the people of your communities, recognise, and it's a bit of a cliche internationally, the authorities about a place are the people of the place. And it actually, it saves an immense amount of money at times. Most councils run asset management plans that have standard rules in them for when you carry out asset maintenance renewal. And that will include every so many years, we will resurface a residential street. And typically, if you actually talk to the people along a residential street, there's a high degree of probability they will say, doesn't need doing.
But that's in the that's in the medium to long term, right? And we live in this really fast and speedy environment where everything, you know, is you know, or at least the argument goes, you know, we don't know what's coming in 5 years, so we better focus on, you know, the next year and maybe the year after. So the problem of having that longer term perspective, which would enable actually bringing people into to see the not just the democratic benefits and in terms of having more ideas and perspectives at the table, but also the financial benefits for councils. So
Well,
how do we deal with that? And also one more thing, Peter. There's an interesting question here as well around resourcing communities, not just councils. So the problem is also, I guess, you need a council that is open and willing to engage its citizens better, its local communities. But then how do you actually enable communities and citizens to engage as well, especially in a very demanding environment of, you know, pressures that are upon you, be it, you know, like work pressures, financial pressures, family pressures. How do you enable people to actually, you know, invest their time and effort into contributing to their communities via, for example, working with the councils? I think there are two dynamics here, right? Yeah. And I would be very interested to hear what you have to say on that.
Well, first, if you think of the long-term versus the short-term, and every council in the country has an ongoing asset renewal and maintenance program, spending millions each year. And I think the very strong evidence is if those spending plans are discussed at the local level with the communities where the expenditure will take place, very often you will find that your proposed expenditure is either gold-plated when it doesn't need to be, or in fact is premature, and in other cases might be the wrong thing and that something else is more important. So the evidence from experience is that when councils actually listen to communities around that sort of thing, they start saving money virtually from day one. And one of the problems in New Zealand is that councils follow a consultation process set out in the Local Government Act, which has been widely discredited in research, incidentally. But it results in the cost of consultation being seen as a cost. It's typically councils will consult around a particular plan or project, and when that's finished, it's all done. There's no value carried forward. When you look at engagement, what you're looking to do is develop capability over the long term. You're looking to create a partnership relationship that has information flowing both ways. In terms of enabling communities to engage, it does require some skill. I have a personal view that that will probably see us moving towards more of a small R regional, small G governance approach. So not necessarily regional councils, but a lot of building centres of excellence and capability for supporting engagement. That needs skilled people, and they, you know, not every council is going to be able to say, okay, I can employ or even find a team of people with the requisite skills. Regionally, I'm probably much better placed to do that. The question of who's involved in it, councils, it might be BHPs, other health providers, and so on and so forth. But the larger question is simply, yes, they do need to be resourced, but also, yes, the evidence shows that it more than pays dividends. And there's another interesting question around the whole consultation thing. Typically, say on a project-based issue, a council will spend 3, 6, 9, 12 months developing a project, and will put people on it who are fully paid, of course, and then they will go out and give the community a month to present its views. And the views will come in, they won't be as in-depth necessarily, and the council will think, oh, you know, what's the point of this? They really don't know what they're talking about. They will probably, during that process, have declined to provide any support for the community in terms of funding, for example, an external expert to provide the kind of advice that the council's experts have provided. And when you actually look more closely at that, what you've got is a situation where the council takes money off the community in order to do what it does, and then says to the community, sorry, we haven't got any left over so that you can contribute to this as well. There's a real mismatch in understanding about the council role as it is and the council role as it could be if it was taking much more of a partnership approach. And the sad thing about it is the evidence is very strong that councils who do take that other approach end up saving money. They end up with a much higher level of trust. They end up with a stronger social license. So it's a win-win.
Yeah, no, I agree. That kind of, you know, those kind of thoughts, they lead us to, I guess, thinking a little bit more about priorities for local government reform. Do you think that the current legislation allows local government actually to achieve the change that we need, achieve, you know, being a truly and genuine well-being council, and to address, for example, issues like climate change? Some of our participants' audience is very interested in that and doubts that councils have the ability at this stage to deal with those big challenges. And what would that reform look like? What would we need to do to enable councils to do better?
Yeah, you can always play around with legislation. But I think when you look at the Local Government Act, there's already enormous power there for councils to do these sorts of things. The issue is not so much the legislation, it's the culture within local government, which is very much around, you know, almost times that, you know, we're a local infrastructure company. It's very much around elected members being in the position of we were elected to decide. And when you're dealing with something like climate change, where you need to bring the community along with you, you don't make much progress by going out and saying to the community, we know best. You make much more progress if you go out and say, can we work together and determine what we should be doing? So there's culture at that level. At the level of central government, central government over the years has failed to understand the potential of local government, or alternatively not wanted to. And there's a real classic standout. When the Auckland Council was established, its legislation required it to prepare a spatial plan, and that was to be prepared around the 4 well-beings. And so the Auckland Council went out and prepared a spatial plan, centred it around the 4 well-beings, and one of the things they did in it was set out some thoughts about how to improve NCEA performance. And folk from an educational background will know that there's quite a strong correlation between the quality of the community and the educational achievement of children within that community. Nick Smith came out and said, you shouldn't be doing that. Education is a central government responsibility, despite the fact that the legislation he'd been responsible for said do it around the 4 well-beings. Now, when you're sending that kind of message out to local government, you're really saying, we don't value the contribution you can make to working with well-being. The current government, I spoke with a senior minister some few months ago and said, you've just put the purpose of promoting community well-being back in the Act. Why isn't central government working with local government on well-being? And his response was, it doesn't have the capability. Now, when those sorts of messages come from central government, it's quite difficult for local government to stand up and say, actually, we can do this, and all of the evidence globally shows that local government is pivotal to this, because it doesn't happen. And one of the things that the Minister of Local Government has been trying to do is to get in place what she calls local governance for community wellbeing. And that's a project her department's been working on for some time. And the idea of that was, okay, we've changed the Act. Now let's put in place ways in which central government and local government can work together. That is basically, well, on hold's a kind way of expressing it, I think, because her colleagues have basically said to her, we're not interested. So there's a very real problem at the local government level of the fact that central government still seems not to realise the potential of what it's got there. And that's not defaulting central government's authority or skill to local government. That is saying, you know, we're training for a long run on recovery. Let's not just work on the right leg only. Let's work on both of them so that we can actually run quite well. And that's the issue we've got, not the legislation.
Yeah, interesting. We have a number of questions here actually on, and we talked about that in our chat before the webinar as well, about, you know, defining actually communities, right? And it all comes back to that, who or how do you include them, and how do you know who to include, I guess. So how do well-being councils actually give a voice to those actually that we can hardly define, I suppose, right? Because there's a complexity of communities out there, especially if you're thinking about, you know, suburbs in Auckland, for instance. How do you define the communities? Do they self-select, for instance, or do you say it's by neighborhood or by ethnicity or by, you know, whatever you randomly choose? How do you make sure that it's an inclusive process?
It is a tough one, and I think it's one that people in government processes find particularly hard to deal with, because the whole thrust of the Weberian bureaucracy is about certainty and rules and precedent.
Yeah.
And when you're told defining communities is at best an art, not a science, and the reality is that you can't do it top down, you've really got to have ways in which communities can identify themselves. I think that leaves the typical bureaucrat feeling very, very uncomfortable, because that's not how things are normally done. But the reality is that's what works. And it's very hard sitting centrally in Wellington as the central government or in the head office of a council to say, we know which community is what. And that's why I referred to the Portland example, which is a very good illustration of a council saying, we do not know where our communities of place are. So let's see if we can design a process. And they did it in consultation with people from the Portland community, a process which will allow communities to come forward and identify themselves. And it's worked extremely well. It produced a set of communities the council would never, ever have been able to identify on its own. And same with communities of interest or ethnicity. You get to a point, and it's partly what you're trying to achieve. You might decide that you don't have a particular role with an interest which is making a claim that that might be someone else's role, so that's not where you go. But you're really stuck with saying, okay, what are the outcomes we are seeking to achieve, and who do we need to take with us on that journey? And then looking at how do we create a means where those parties, those communities can get involved with us. And you have to be quite creative. And going back to Wiltshire, one of they have done some really interesting things with establishing communities and engaging with communities. And one of the issues they had was, we know within our district there are a range of people, interest groups if you will, who are very hard, who are unlikely to want to engage with us because they don't trust us or they don't feel confident. They had quite a trailer community, for example, gypsies, army wives, 3 military bases in Wiltshire, a number of other groups who found it very hard. So what they had to do, or what they decided they needed to do, was reach out around the district of the council to find people who could be connectors, who were prepared and able to work with the council, but also had the trust, say, of the gypsy community, or who had connections into a network of army wives and military base or whatever, and enable those communities, or those connectors rather, to facilitate those communities telling their stories to the council, and that worked very well. So it is about thinking creatively. It's looking at what people have done elsewhere. It's drawing on the very rich and varied experience around the globe, because there's no one size fits all around this. There's no formula that you automatically apply. It's more openness to recognizing that you don't know and you need to learn.
So if you were in a position where you could set the framework, the ideal framework for central government, for public service agencies to work with local government and local government with communities, how would that look like? What would be the central mechanisms that you, or principles that you would that would make up your framework to actually enable better work together?
I think you would probably start with asking what you were trying to achieve. And in the context of current government policy, presumably what we're trying to achieve is improvement in well-being. And that's a contested area at the moment, as you probably know. And you've got the Living Standards Framework with its various indicators. You've got the indicators that Solomon developed for local government. And then you've got a view that some of the leading people in wellbeing thinking in New Zealand would argue that the real question is how people, how communities identify their own well-being. So do you know, is it analysis of big data, or is it listening to the subjective feelings of people in different areas and different interest groups and so on? So I think you really have to start with a serious understanding of what is well-being. And you can't just go down a path of statistical analysis, and that's useful. And that'll point to areas where you've got problems, for example. But if you're really concerned that, yes, we want to improve well-being, it's critical to understand it's not your well-being, it's the well-being of the people who are the object of your activity. And you can only do that by understanding how they see it. So it's more, and that, I think, flows down. That's where I think local government plays an important role, because if you're a central government, you can't work in that way with perhaps more than 1,000 different communities. That task would be impossible. But you can enable, and local government is the best mechanism we have, you can enable others to undertake that kind of activity. And so you're looking at how do you link down, down, down. The Minister for Children, for example, doesn't sit around saying, I know the circumstances of every family across New Zealand. And she probably doesn't expect Oranga Tamariki to know that either. Others tend to get involved with that. So you're looking at who's got the capability, where does it need to lie? And there's some really interesting stuff happening in the public health space, for example, where public health practitioners, because they know that they're in an area where you can't just go out and say to people, you must do this, that they need, you know, to implement public health policy, you actually need collaboration. You need people prepared to do what you want them to do. So they've become very used, certainly in the UK, and I think it's certainly a discussion here, to understanding that you need to listen to different interests and different communities and work with them in the way that they prefer. And it was, I had a discussion with one of the senior people in Public Health England a couple of years ago. And he said the two issues that they'd really confronted was, first, when we want to reach out to people on public health matters, we have to talk their language, not ours. And that might sound odd, but it's reasonably clear, and linguists will tell you this, that the language that bureaucracies use, and which is everyday language for people within bureaucracies, is not the language that people on the street talk. And they may not understand it. So that was his first point. We need to talk in their language, not ours. And secondly, we need to meet them in their place, not ours. So all of that means that you need to look at highly distributed systems, and you need to look at how people understand that they need to respect and learn from, rather than go out and tell.
And it links actually back to an earlier question that we had on data and information that communities bring and that councils need to pick up in order to develop those well-being concepts for their communities, for their regions, and what it means, right? And the big question is, how does it get more visibility as well? But that's a question for another time. I unfortunately have to draw it to an end, but I have one last question, because I really liked it, because it was so up to the point. One thing, Peter, that you would suggest to move from an administrative council to a well-being council? One word or one sentence. That's a challenge.
It's a challenge, because my answer mightn't be particularly helpful in the context of what we talked about. I think the critical issue that we need to address is the culture and governance of local government. We have a governance structure that was designed in the days when councillors did their work on the kitchen table in the 1980s. And we have an environment which is completely different. So we have a major disconnect between the demands of governance and local government and the support and resourcing for the governance activity. And that's the first thing that I would really address, and that's tough.
Well, it all sounds pretty tough, but we shouldn't feel discouraged. I think there are all, you know, I think like so many opportunities really as well, right? And it sounds, if we get it right, if we give people a voice, then we can really tackle some of the major challenges that we identified. And we can't actually afford not to try, I suppose.
Yeah,
although it will be hard, but
one of the key things, if you want to get from A to B, probably the first thing you need to know clearly is, where is A?
Yeah.
Because if you don't know where you're starting from, however gloomy that might be or positive, then you're not likely to have a very successful journey.
Well, we certainly reached point B, which is the end of our webinar, Peter. Thank you so much. And as always, thank you for all the questions as well. And we will make again an effort to get the unanswered questions to Peter, and he will try to answer them, and we'll inform you how we are going to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. So you will all hear from us, and you will get your questions answered. If you liked it, as always, please share on your social media and tell people about it. Our next webinar will be with Jamie Walker on the 24th of June, so in 2 weeks' time, and she will be talking about reinterpreting community and public services after COVID-19. So it should be an interesting conversation. And we already went a little bit over time, so sorry everyone, but I'm sure you found it as interesting as I did. And I will leave you with a big thank you and stay well.
Thank you, everyone. And I look forward